Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good day. Welcome to the first part of Nationalism and the Unification of Germany for ninth grade world history. I'm Mr. Rosenberg of Whitney High School in Cerritos, California, and I'm saying that because I know that some people are actually paying attention to some of these broadcasts and are even sending me texts from different parts of the country, which is pretty cool. Thank you very much. Anyway, I'm doing this on the fly instead of using a formal script. I'm also not going to be doing much editing of the video, getting rid of the ums and the ums that I know that I do. I probably won't have too many silly jokes because, well, there's no audience to play to. Though once in a while I will probably do a stupid joke and you'll probably not get it, but I'll be laughing at you. Anyway, let's get this started. Nationalism and the Unification of Italy and Germany, the first part. Take notes, as you normally do, using the templates that you can find on the Rosenworld website. And if you don't know where to find them, it should be up on resources. Download them and make a copy. Eventually, you'll be scanning in the notes and sending them to me, but not just yet. So let us begin. We begin with something that you've already dealt with because you did the reading on the Congress of Vienna, and that is the idea of what occurred after Napoleon fell. As you already know, the nations of Europe redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon had been defeated. And our job here is not to focus on that, but instead to focus on the different political ideas that came about. I'm going to just briefly go through some of these ideas and spend a little bit more time on the more obscure ideas. The age that we're speaking about from 1815 to 1848 is called the Age of Metternich, and Metternich was the foreign minister for Austria after the fall of Napoleon. And he was such a central figure. His philosophy, his political philosophy, became such a central feature for Europe that an age is named for him, although he's pretty much been forgotten by most folks. He was driven by what we would call conservatism. Now, don't confuse conservatism of the 19th century with conservatism today, especially in the United States. It's not quite the same thing. The idea of conservatism was that the French Revolution had shown, without a doubt, what happens if crazy radical ideas go too far. It's sort of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Conservatives like Metternich believed that while change is inevitable, change will happen, that change must be taken into very careful consideration. That is to say, don't toss out the institutions that work in order just to change. For example, if in the eyes of certain folks, let's say Social Security works, then there is really no need to go further and create, let's say, a guaranteed income that they believe would cause things to change a little bit too radically. And of course, if things get too radical, then you're going to be engulfed by, the craziness that happens during revolutions, including mass executions and so forth. So Metternich's idea was that any change that would come to Europe would come slowly, and in fact that the old institutions not only should be continued, but old institutions that they believed would work, including monarchy, would continue. This is why, as you'll see, you've seen already in the reading, and will continue to read, was why conservatives were very interested in bringing back monarchies in places like France, and to keep places like Italy from unifying, and so forth. The idea is that the only people who should be ruled should be ruling is through an idea called legitimacy. So if you are from the line of kings for France, you have a legitimate right to rule, as opposed to, let's say, the people who don't have a legitimate right. If you went even further than Metternich with conservatism, you were then a reactionary. That is to say, without thought, any idea of change would bring an immediate reaction, and that reaction would be no way, no how. In our time today, there are many who argue that conservative politics has become more reactionary rather than proactive. But that's something we don't need to go through right now. Conservatism then created critics who believed that, yes, the French Revolution went way, way too far. But there were some things in the French Revolution, and in fact, the Enlightenment ideas that sparked the French Revolution, that were, well, a pretty darn good idea. Many of these ideas included that the franchise should be opened up, more people or more men should be given the right to vote, to choose their leaders, that absolute power for kings is not a very good thing. Personal liberty, especially the liberty to go out and invest and hopefully make a lot of money through the capitalistic economic ideas that were coming to fruition at the time, all that stuff was a good thing. If you look at the cartoon over here, liberalism versus Toryism. Toryism is another word for conservatism. You get an idea of this sort of thinking. The guy over to the left on the Pegasus, where it reads liberalism has a flag saying free education, free religion, freedom of the slaves, free commerce, and so forth. The ideas of being allowed to take personal responsibility for your lives. And as you can see here, with being progress and economy, efficiency, and a bright future. While the nonconformists, the Tories, the conservatives, would be sitting down just trying to keep things as they are. Do not confuse liberalism of the 19th century with liberalism today, again, especially in the United States. American liberalism today has almost nothing to do with the liberalism of the time. It's just kept the same terms. You might even hear a term called neoliberalism. Again, that is nothing that you should be concerned with when you look in the 19th century. That's something more for our time, and we don't need to go through that. When you study economics, you will get to see a great deal about neoliberalism when it comes to economic systems. But again, we're not going to be spending much time on concepts like liberalism. The last concept, or the last ism, that we're going to be looking at very, very quickly is the idea of nationalism. Now, most of you know what nationalism is, that sense of being part of that your greatest loyalty is to your country, as opposed to, let's say, your state or your religion or your nationality or something like that. We consider ourselves, for example, most of us here consider ourselves Americans. Some of you consider yourself Indians first, or Koreans first, and that's perfectly fine. Nationalism was not really as developed back then as it is today. It took Napoleon and his armies going through the territory that comprises now of Italy and Germany and Russia and so forth in order to create nationalism as we understand it today. Germans balked at the idea of French occupiers basically telling them what to do. It brought out their differences, their Germanist qualities as with the Russians or as with the Italians, and so on and so forth. Keep in mind, however, that nationalism is not a thing in and of itself. There is you can't buy nationalism on a shelf. It's a state of mind. It's a way of thinking, and one's sense of loyalty can easily be changed simply by that mindset. All of us think, well, most of us think of ourselves as good, loyal Americans, but who knows, in 20 years from now, the United States conceivably could break up into different regions, and we might see ourselves more as Californians first than as Americans second. And if you don't believe this, I mean, look at how quickly people in the American South changed right before the Civil War. They were loyal and good Americans, and suddenly there was a mindset. We have seceded from the Union, and they were no longer Americans, they were Confederates, and they felt this right through and through. And then when the war was over, most of them became Americans again. Nationalities can be created out of thin air. 100 years ago, there was no such nationality as Palestinian. Today, of course, we look at the Palestinians as a separate people. Now there are people who would deny this as saying, well, there's no such thing as the Palestinians or any other group that wants to break off. But again, nationalism is a state of mind. It's a way of thinking. And this became the state of mind in the 19th century. Italians began looking at their history, and they said to themselves, you know, maybe we're not really Lombardians or Sicilians or Romans, when we in fact all have this common history. We all have this common language. We are Italian. The Greeks would feel the same way. The Germans would unify, as you'll see a little bit later, due to this concept of folk, of the people, nationalistic feelings. Again, I'm not going to be spending much time on this because most of you know this idea. And what I would like to do is to just point you out to some readings in the regular assignments and move on to what I consider stuff that's a little more interesting for what we need to do. I'm going to be focusing on the idea right now of utilitarianism. And this is an idea that came about by people who were wondering when the conflict between liberals and conservatives come out, is there a different way? Is there a third way, perhaps? And the two gentlemen that you can see here, the one to the left is Jeremy Bentham, and the man to the right is John Stuart Mills, are considered the originators of utilitarianism. An idea that perhaps many of you would agree with on how we should govern ourselves and what should it be based on. Both of these men looked at human beings, look at society and ask, what is it that we're really looking for? And they could go back to the ancient Greeks like Socrates and Plato, and their conclusion is that really most of us are going after happiness. And we want to do everything to avoid pleasure, to avoid pain. We all want to have pleasure. So they argued that the role of government is to attempt to extend as much happiness as it can to as many people as they can. That is to say, as Mr. Spock said in the second Star Trek movie, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the good. And this is a political idea that these two men brought out, which is still pretty influential today. Here are four things that we can see from utilitarianism. First, it recognized the fundamental role of pain and pleasure in human rights. in human life. We do everything we can to avoid pain and do everything we can to get pleasure. You, for example, are going to a very difficult school, a comprehensive school, and it brings to you a great deal of pain, having to actually physically go to school and do all the hard work. But you get a great deal of pleasure from it as well, from the social aspects of it, the learning aspects, and the fact that it will help you get into the college, university that you want. And they felt that most of our lives were based on this idea. Going for pleasure, keeping away from pain. Although if you come across the two, it would be pain that you would avoid even if you have to give up pleasure. The second thing is it approves or disapproves of an action on the basis of the amount of pain or pleasure that was brought about, that is to say, by consequences. So an action like feeding the hungry would be approved by utilitarians because of the amount of pleasure that would bring about. Slavery would be something that utilitarians would disapprove of because of the amount of pain that it would create. Now, of course, many of you are already thinking about what about interpretations? One man's pain is another person's pleasure. And again, it has to do with numbers. For number 3, it equates the good with the pleasurable and the evil with pain, and that's pretty self-evident. And fourth, it asserts that pleasure and pain are capable of quantification and hence of measure. That is to say that we can measure the amount of good that something does or the amount of pain that something does. So if for example, one person suffers from a decision that helps millions, then that person's pleasure must be put aside, and that person will have to have pain in order for everyone else to have pleasure. It's a little bit cutthroat in a way because it does seem to ignore the good, the needs of the minority. But utilitarians have this idea that eventually everyone would come to an understanding of what is the good, and everyone will want the same good. And those who, for their own good, would create evil, well, that would be winnowed out as human beings change. Another way of looking at this is from this little cartoon with peanuts-like characters, where you have the greatest happiness is, quote, actions are right in the proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain and the privation of pleasure. And that's from John Stuart Mills. The reading of utilitarianism from 1863 is something that many of you may want to give a try one day. Finally, a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. Maybe this illustrates utilitarianism best. I want the truck, Twinkie. No, it's mine, Mo. I bought it from home. I said, give me the truck. Mo, you can't just take things from people because you're bigger. I'm not taking it. You're giving it to me because we'll both be so much happier that way. How touching. Utilitarianism way in action, but maybe not the way that Calvin wants it to happen. Let's take a look at utilitarianism through this chart, and this will give you a better idea about it. So we can see a blanket definition of utilitarianism: whatever is good must be good for people. And this has created 3 schools of libertarianism, as you can see, called hedonistic utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism, and welfare utilitarianism. From these two, hedonistic and preference, we can see it's based on subjective experience of pleasure and pain, or stable preferences, that is to say, what people think. And it comes in 2 forms: in the idealistic form, that only Ideal pleasures or preferences count, and of course that's pretty hedonistic, and that's why it gets that word. And the idea of egalitarian, that all preferences and pleasures are equally worthy. Now, you may or may not agree with these ideas. I certainly don't, but it's important to have a good understanding. Welfare utilitarianism is based on an objectively defined life interested, in other words, monetary wealth and access to healthcare and so forth. Welfare utilitarianism is pretty much close to, let's say, something like Bernie Sanders and what he goes for, or 20th century liberals, as opposed to 19th century liberals in American politics until the last, let's say, 50 years or so. One interesting side note, and you don't have to get this down, but Jeremy Bentham, one of the creators of utilitarianism, was extremely, extremely weird. He had this idea in order to inspire people of something like statues. Here's from Pat Nixon Park here in Cerritos. But instead of actual statues, he wanted to take great men and women who had done terrific things, and after their deaths, get them embalmed in a special process, and that he would have these famous people put in places like parks and buildings as inspiration for other people. It's a silly idea, but it actually came in a way to fruition. If you go to University College in London, you can actually find one of these things, and it was Jeremy Bentham himself who had his skeletal remains basically stuffed, put in costume, and he's on display as a as something to be inspired by. That's not actually his face. It's a wax replica. During the 19th century, his face was stolen over and over again by frat boys, and so was put elsewhere for protection. But you can go and visit Jeremy Bentham anytime you want to, and once in a while he's actually brought into a meeting of the board at the University College in London. He's marked down as present, but not voting. Yeah, the English are weird. It's not their fault. Another alternative to liberalism was the idea of socialism. And most of you are familiar with socialism, or at least you've heard about socialism. And of course, nowadays, it's in this country, it's pretty much been vilified. But you got to take it from the point of view or from the experience of the people living at the time. On the top, and this is a Spanish cartoon, at the top you can see in the 19th century the divide between the rich and the poor. On the left side there you have the capitalist with a plate load of food, champagne, flowers, good clothing, he even has a tablecloth, while the worker has a smaller allocation and ragged clothing. The idea then is that tomorrow is that we should be sharing more of what we have. So the capitalist over to the left is a worker himself. He has a shovel. He gets as much as the poor man does. And they both have the tablecloth. They both have the flour in the middle. The idea was that there is enough for everyone to share, and not just to be given to a small group of people. Socialism became very, very popular in Europe. Its symbol was or is the red rose. And again, here in the United States, we're still tackling the question of how much should government interfere. But we don't need to go into this too much. Before I forget, here in the United States, our idea of socialism is that it's pretty much stealing from one to give to another. You have the guy over there in the left side of the cartoon asking the rich heavyset guy for spare change, and he takes it from someone else. That's supposed to be Socialism Illustrated. We, of course, have socialism in this country in many forms, school, roads, police, and so forth. Again, the question is, how much socialism should we have? But that's a debate for another time. For some, socialism was not enough. There needed to be a fundamental change in how society operates completely. And it was up to folks like Karl Marx to come up with a system of thinking, a system of thought that he believed would transform everything. Marx would be very influential around the world to folks like in Russia, Vladimir Lenin, eventually Joseph Stalin. And it was Marx who created the idea, in order to prove his theory, called the dialectic. As you can see here, the practice of arriving at a conclusion by the exchange of logical arguments, usually at the form of questions and answers. It was through the dialectic that Marx read history, analyzed it, and from his reading and analysis, believed that he could predict what the future was going to be like. And to understand the dialectic and understand how he arrived at it, let's take a look at how it works. With the dialectic, you begin with your thesis, your idea. Let me make this incredibly simple, and this one really isn't part of the dialectic, but go with it anyway. You have your thesis, your idea. So our thesis is the concept or the idea of the color white. He would then argue that the thesis creates, through argument and discussion, its counterpart or its counterproposal, the antithesis. So if my thesis is the color white, the antithesis then must be the color black. We would then argue black versus white, white versus black, and so on and so on and so forth, until we, through our argument, come up with something called the synthesis. We bring our ideas together, and, well, from black and from white, we can create something called gray. We can go with that. That gray then becomes the new thesis, and it in turn creates its own antithesis. And the narrowing down of the thought, the sharpening of ideas goes down and down and down. Now, originally, Marx's mentor Hegel believed that eventually we would reach to an understanding of God himself, but Marx didn't go that way. He believed that through the dialectic, we would get the conclusion that we would have a perfect society. Let's see how he worked it out. The dialectic in action had this going on for himself in his reading of history. He began with the thesis that you had the ideas way back in the Middle Ages of the feudal lords. The feudal lords then, through the dialectic, created the antithesis. And the antithesis in this case was the serfs and peasants. Feudal lords, serfs and peasants. That kind of makes sense. And it was the conflict between the feudal lords and the serfs and peasants that eventually created a synthesis between the two, which he said was city life. After all, the serfs and peasants moved to the cities, the feudal lords no longer had the power, and the cities took over. From the city life, he said, came its antithesis. Now, most of you would probably think city life, country life. But he said, no, it was in fact the guilds, that is to say, the early medieval unions, was the antithesis. They argued, they fought, they came into conflict, and eventually, he said, this conflict conflict led to something called entrepreneurs, the men and the women who take what capital they have and create brand new ideas, like, investing your money on a 7-Eleven or creating a new way to catch mice and so forth. These entrepreneurs then created their own antithesis, and that was the proletariat, the working people. After all, if you're an entrepreneur and you have a factory, you're going to have workers, and those workers would be the proletariat. He said eventually there will be conflict between the entrepreneurs, the proletariat, and and so forth, and it would end up with a classless society. That is to say, a society where everyone is equal, and he called that idea communism. This was extremely influential. Now today we can see that most of this is pretty much silly. After all, you really can't predict the future, and to say that a synthesis of entrepreneurs and proletariat is immediately going to be creating a classless society is pretty much, wishful thinking. But it was an idea that took hold of many folks because it seemed to take something that was impossible to understand, which was history and the flow of the human drama, and it made it a great story. And it was a story that was going to have a happy ending, and that happy ending would be, the beautiful communist future that all of us would have in common. Heaven on earth, so to speak. And one could even say it's a substitute for the Christian idea of, a heavenly afterlife. But in this case, the paradise is going to be real and within our lifetime, or at least within someone else's lifetime. It never seems to reach yours. Of course, it went to absurd levels. This is a Chinese communist depiction of this paradise. And I'm not quite sure if this was made as a parody of the Chinese, because I'm looking at this guy in the rocket and I'm thinking, yeah, maybe. The reality, of course, is it really did not quite work, and the whole thing broke down in the mid 1980s and early 1990s. Well, what do you expect? There were some folks who believed that the real problem is government itself. This is a little bit influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And the idea is that what's causing so much trouble is the government itself. And the idea of anarchy, everyone being against all authority, no gods, no masters, became also popular at the time, although it was confused a lot with communism, which had some elements of anarchy within it, but we don't need to go into that right now. Most anarchists believe that the ultimate goal is to turn the world into some sort of Burning Man, everyone just doing things the way they want to and so forth, and everyone living in harmony together, holding hands and singing "We Are the World" and so forth. But where we have really seen anarchy in action was places like Somalia, where, yeah, you had Burning Man, but Burning Man in a very, very different way. Anarchy is not something that really has worked. Okay, that brings us to the end of part 1. You can watch or listen to this video as many times as you want. If you find anything that you have questions about, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. We'll be moving on to part 2, which will deal with the unification of Italy, and afterwards part 3, which will deal with the unification of Germany, but again, not right now. Anyway, for all of you, please keep healthy, keep safe. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.